Hey, this is Zulem Urbina, and tune into the relay for the latest news in boxing all around the world. Thank you for supporting myself and other female boxers. We truly appreciate it.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, Dan Rafael tweeted, the WBA has notified Yordenis Ugas and Stanionis. A purse bid is scheduled for their welterweight title fight December 9th in Miami. Minimum bid is $200,000. Split is 75-25 in Ugas' favor. Winner has to fight Butaev, and I'm sure that Yordenis Ugas is none too pleased to receive this news. I wondered where we were with all of this since things went pretty quiet
for a while.
In reference to it, Yordenis Ugas himself tweeted, the welterweight champions Crawford and Spence are making Hall of Fame careers. It is an honor to be a champion in the same era as them. Hopefully Crawford comes to Premier Boxing and has a great tournament to get an undisputed 140-pound champion. It would be a great gift for all of the fans. Since that news broke that Yordenis Ugas was under orders to satisfy a mandatory challenger in Stanionis and participate in a four-man WBA tournament,
he's been at odds with the WBA.
He hasn't been happy. The same WBA that elevated him to full champion, the same WBA that put that world title right there, the one that makes him a priority, to Errol Spence.
They're the ones that demoted Manny to a champion in recess and made Ugas full champion.
They put that title in his hands. That same WBA that he's currently at odds with.
They want him to satisfy a mandatory.
They're under direct orders from the ABC Commission to scale back their baby belts, their secondary titles, and a part of doing that is hosting tournaments like this one, this WBA four-man tournament.
It has already kicked off with Butaev versus James.
Butaev emerged the victor. Now the second leg of that tournament is underway. Yordenis Ugas must face Stanionis.
Ugas' problem was timing.
Timing is everything after all, and he picked the wrong time to petition the WBA to unify with Errol Spence Jr. It's not going to work. At the time that Ugas filed his petition to unify with the unified welterweight champion Errol Spence Jr., Errol wasn't medically cleared to fight.
You don't get to skip your mandatory to play the waiting game.
You all know what happened. Initially, it was supposed to be Spence versus Pacquiao, but Spence's retina got detached. He couldn't fight.
So Ugas stood in his place?
And the prognosis for Spence wasn't looking too good. That he might have to sit out for 6 months to a year to allow that eye to heal.
Well, the WBA wasn't going to wait that long.
Not while they're under threat of penalty, not while they're under direct orders from the Alphabet Commission to start scaling back all those secondary titles, or they'll be banned from doing business in the United States.
Well, they weren't going to allow Ugas to play the waiting game.
Because that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to take the rest of the year off, and the WBA...
What he wanted to do was wait for Errol's eye to heal.
We already knew. Errol's not coming back this year. In all likelihood, he won't come back till several months into the following year.
WBA's not about to freeze up the ranks to accommodate Yordenis Ugas.
In so many words, what they told him is that he can't skip his mandatory challenger to try and unify with a fighter that can't fight. Try and unify with a fighter that isn't even medically cleared to fight. That was Ugas' problem, the timing of his petition, because at the time that he filed that petition, Errol wasn't cleared to fight. He wasn't even cleared to spar.
Oh, he might be now.
But this is after the fact. After the ABC Commission put the squeeze on the WBA, after the WBA started ordering fights throughout different weight classes to start phasing out those secondary titles, after they ordered this four-man tournament that Ugas is all wrapped up in.
You're a day late and $1 short.
To straight talk this, I'm actually glad that the WBA is sticking to their guns and making Yordenis Ugas fight in this four-man tournament, because now Errol Spence Jr., he doesn't have him to lean on.
Doesn't have him to use as an excuse to not fight Crawford.
And at this point, I'm not even expecting Errol Spence Jr. to fight Terrence Crawford. At this point, it's just about exposing Errol for what he is. Exposing that he never wanted the Crawford fight, that he'd rather fight anybody than fight that guy, because Ugas, he's not available to you.
From the moment Ugas was elevated to full champion, Errol expressed more interest in him than he did in Crawford.
As if it's Yordenis Ugas people have been asking Errol to fight for all these years. As if it's an Ugas versus Spence fight that everybody's been asking for.
You know, he already pulled this crap when Sean Porter had the WBC title.
At a time when the buzz for Crawford versus Spence had reached a fever pitch, and the fight's profile was at an all-time high, Errol Spence Jr. made the decision to prioritize a Sean Porter fight over a Terrence Crawford fight, even though it's the Crawford fight everybody was asking for. It's the Crawford fight that everybody was talking about. But Errol, he had other plans. And When I see this situation with Yordenis Ugas...
I'm glad Errol ain't got him to use as an excuse.
I know more than a lot of people, that boxing news is fluid and ever-changing. This might be the story today, but the story tomorrow could be something else. Could be that maybe they manage to get Stanionis to step aside, or they pull some strings, get the WBA to stand down on this order. A lot of things can happen between now and December 9th. But if the story sticks, as does the order, I'm glad to see it.
Because I'm sick of Errol Spence's excuses.
Errol Spence Jr., who accused Terrence Crawford of being on the wrong side of the street years ago because he was a top-ranked fighter. Well, he's not a top-ranked fighter anymore. He's a network and promotional free agent. And at this time, he is the only champion available for you to unify with. So if you're okay to unify with the Yordenis Ugas at some point next year...
The eye's not an issue.
The detached retina that he suffered in sparring, the inactivity he's faced in the year of 2021, if none of that was going to stop him from unifying titles with another welterweight champion, why should it stop him from fighting Terrence Crawford? Ugas isn't available.
Crawford is. Why don't you go unify with him?
The WBA's four-man tournament, and I'm sticking to it, appears to have ruffled some feathers, and in truth, I can care less whose feathers are ruffled as a result of this order. As far as I'm concerned, this is good news, welcome news, because now Errol ain't got Ugas to use as an excuse to keep avoiding Terrence Crawford. Whether you're for the WBA's four-man tournament or you're not for it, you're against it, it doesn't fucking matter, because so long as the story sticks, it still means the same thing. Ugas ain't available to fight, and the only way he gets out of this tournament is by forfeiting the WBA title.
Well, if he does that, he won't even be a priority to Errol Spence.
That WBA title's the only reason he looked at him in the first place, and he said as much himself. Well, Ugas isn't available, so if Errol's still in the market for another alphabet title, Crawford's got one, and he's gunning for you. Why aren't you gunning for him? Terrence Crawford, who very recently made an appearance on the Porter Way podcast and mentioned Errol by name,
among several others.
Yordenis Ugas stated that he'd like to see WBO welterweight champion Terrence Crawford cross over to the PBC side of things so he can engage in a tournament of champions. And you know what?
What?
That just might happen.
If you could pick three hit lists, give it to us. Who are the next three fights?
Yeah, I had to be Keith Thurman, Ugas, and Earl. Any order. It don't matter. It don't matter any order.
You heard what Terrence said. That's who he's gunning for. He's gunning for PBC fighters. He wants some more PBC scalps. He just collected the scalp of Sean Porter. Now he's gunning for Keith, he's gunning for Errol, he's gunning for Ugas. In no particular order.
Last week he was asked about Josh Taylor.
Ahead of last weekend's welterweight contest, he was asked about what might happen beyond that. And he was asked about Josh Taylor, and Terrence didn't seem none too interested.
Says he don't expect to face him in the near future.
That's what he said. Then he has the fight with Sean, he stops Sean, he goes on Sean's podcast, he starts naming PBC fighters. Some weeks ago, Terrence Crawford himself said that he was past the Errol Spence Jr. fight, but weeks later, that doesn't appear to be the case. Not if he's naming him as part of a short list of names he has in his crosshairs for what he wants for the immediate future. It doesn't look to me like he's past the Errol Spence Jr. fight.
I don't know, maybe he had a change of heart.
I feel like Bob held you back. Between me and you, don't worry about nobody else listening. I feel like you missed out about $75 million, bro. I feel like my man held you back. I don't know how much you made, but it's time to go get this money, Terrence. And don't fight forever, bro, but go get this money.
No, for sure, man. I feel like, there was a lot of opportunities left on the table. You know what I mean? Not only with fighters, but also with pay-per-view. You know what I mean? Like, for instance, me and Sean Porter fought on the app.
Right.
There were so many people that was telling me they don't know how to get the app on the TV. They don't know how to do it. And, the average elderly or person that doesn't, know tech, they're not going to know how to get the app on the TV. So what they do, they don't buy it. Yep. So I feel like, that was a setup at his own right then and there.
There are some elements of that conversation that Terrence had on the Porterway podcast that don't sit well with me. I mean, for starters, doing the fight on the app, the ESPN Plus app, That effectively cuts out the cable and satellite companies who would have taken upwards of 30 to 40% of whatever came in. ESPN Plus doing it themselves on their own platform.
It's a bigger profit margin.
Because you're cutting out the middleman. You're not dealing with the cable and satellite companies that want to take upwards of 30 to 40% of whatever comes in. Doing it on the app gives you a bigger profit margin. That's the rhyme and the reason behind that, though I didn't hear that tidbit iterated on the Porter Way podcast. That was the hierarchy of thought for putting Crawford versus Porter on an app.
That's why you would do that.
Moreover, apps are all the rage these days. More and more Americans are cutting the cord.
Television experience is a lot more personal these days.
More personalized, more customized. The days of having 50, 60, 100 fucking channels of shit that you don't watch, those days are coming to an end. Essentially what I'm getting at here is the idea that the fight didn't do good numbers because it was on an app as opposed to a conventional cable pay-per-view, that is a logical fallacy.
Have you seen what these pay-per-views have been doing these days?
Numbers are down all around across the board for everyone. You look at the Wilder vs. Fury trilogy earlier this year. That pay-per-view is down 200,000 buys from what it did last year. Last year, it was reported to have done around 800 to 850,000. This year, it only did about 600,000. It's down 200,000 buys. You look at Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view late last year, the one with Danny Garcia, and the one he did before that with Mikey Garcia, and you'll notice that the numbers for the Danny Garcia fight, they're down from the time that Errol fought Mikey Garcia.
From 360 with Mikey to 250 with Danny.
That's a difference of about 110,000 pay-per-view buys, folks. A difference of 110,000. Errol Spence Jr.'s numbers are down, too. Andy Ruiz and Chris Arreola, they were on pay-per-view not that long ago. Their numbers weren't nothing to write home about. Neither were the numbers for the Charlo doubleheader. Charlo versus Derevyanchenko, Charlo versus Rosario. A doubleheader featuring both brothers. And all that did was a little over 100,000 buys. Numbers are down all over the place for everyone.
Not just Terrence Crawford.
I mean, even the name of Manny Pacquiao wasn't enough to crack 300,000 buys very recently for what turned out to be Manny's swan song, his final fight before leaving the sport of boxing. That fight only did a little over 200,000 buys. I think those were Manny's worst recorded numbers, in recent memory at least.
Certainly was a sharp decline from what he did with Keith Thurman.
Numbers are down. Numbers are down for everyone. And I can identify at least 2 to 3 reasons, primarily 3, why Terrence Crawford's pay-per-view didn't do big numbers. You know, the feist thing is, who was actually asking for this fight? I wanted to see Crawford versus Spence at the height of that fight's popularity when it had a profile, whereas Errol Spence Jr.'s fans, they were the ones that were asking for this fight. They were the ones that were clamoring for this. They wanted to see Terrence Crawford in there with Sean Porter based on how Sean performed with Errol. And they get the fight, but they didn't fucking buy it.
Bozos like me bought the fight.
You have to understand something. The Sean Porter fight was a great fight, very entertaining, all that jazz. But all that was an alternative, a substitute.
That's not what the paying public was asking for.
No, that is what Errol Spence Jr.'s fans were asking for. And when they got it, they didn't want to pull out their wallets. They didn't want to buy the fight. They didn't buy the fight.
You can't rely on them to do big numbers because Errol didn't do big numbers the last time out.
Now that's the first problem. That the Sean Porter fight doesn't supply a demand because there wasn't a big demand for that fight in the feist fucking place. It was a good fight, and I had hoped it would have done decent numbers on pay-per-view, but it didn't. And I can only deduce the reason it didn't was because that's not the welterweight showdown everybody's been asking to see. What they want to see is Crawford versus Spence.
Sean's always been a fun fighter to watch, but he's never been a big draw.
The second problem I have with what was said on the Porter Way podcast by Terrence Crawford is that the fight being on an app affected the buy rate, but Terrence Crawford's made 2 pay-per-view appearances
2 of them
off the app. And those pay-per-views didn't yield big numbers either. The Victor Postol pay-per-view, the Amir Khan pay-per-view, those weren't on an app.
And those pay-per-views didn't do big numbers either.
So where do you get that fighting on an app is the reason you didn't do big numbers?
You gotta be honest with yourself here.
I think Terrence Crawford is one of the best fighters, pound for pound, in the world, in the entire sport of boxing. But what he isn't, what he's never really been, is a big draw.
And there's no shame in that because that applies to a lot of guys these days.
Which brings us to the third problem I identified with this situation. The third problem I saw. Terence Crawford had a pay-per-view going down the same month as Canelo Alvarez. A good chunk of the fight fans already paid cash money to see him earlier this month. And ESPN Plus, people at Top Rank, they're expecting them to pay cash money again in the same month to see you.
2 pay-per-views in the same month.
There was another pay-per-view the month before that, before Canelo Alvarez's pay-per-view with Deontay Wilder and Tyson Fury. So you got a pay-per-view happening the month before yours, another pay-per-view happening the same month as yours, and yet another pay-per-view happening the month after. You'll notice that there is a proliferation of pay-per-views happening in the American market, happening in sequence, and it's very off-putting to the fight fans. The fight fans don't want to have to pay for a pay-per-view every single month, but that's what the powers that be.
That's what they're expecting me and you to do.
And that's affecting the buy rate of these pay-per-views all across the board, all around.
There's far too many of them.
And if I'm being honest, a good number of these fights don't even belong on pay-per-view. The pay-per-view model works best when there's actually a grassroots interest for an event, an actual demand, because that's the way it works. Supply and demand. The pay-per-view hopes to supply that demand. But when there isn't an actual demand, a palpable interest in a particular fight...
A fight like Porter versus Crawford ending up on pay-per-view has more to do with satisfying the fighters' purse demands than satisfying the fans.
And satisfying their demands, because they weren't demanding Crawford versus Porter. They were actually demanding Crawford versus Spence, and they got this in its place. But this isn't really what they wanted. This isn't really what they've been asking for all these years.
The only guys that were asking for this are guys that don't actually buy pay-per-views.
The truth is, this is about more than just Terence Crawford. This is bigger than him, bigger than his fight with Sean Porter. The truth is that a good number of these fights, they're not on the scale of De La Hoya versus Trinidad, Mayweather versus Pacquiao, or even Mayweather versus Cotto. The truth is that a good number of these fights are more about satisfying the fighters' purse demands, their egos, than satisfying the fans. The truth is that a good number of these fights end up on pay-per-view where they don't belong because of the fighters' inflated purse demands. And when the networks won't put up the money and the promoters won't either, they hope that the fans will foot the bill. And they quickly find out that the fans weren't all that interested in a particular fight.
The only guy doing any real kind of numbers right now is Canelo.
And that's because he has a rather large contingent of fans behind him. Fans who were interested in seeing him become an undisputed champion at super middleweight in the four-belt era.
That's just the truth.
And that's why there's a noticeable discrepancy between what he just did on pay-per-view and what everyone else is doing. The problem wasn't Bob, and the problem wasn't the app, it wasn't ESPN Plus. The real problem was that the paying public wanted Crawford versus Spence, and they got this instead.